The dust was a living thing, a choking shroud Ilara breathed with every shallow gasp. It coated her cracked lips, settled in the lines etched by sun and sorrow around her eyes, a constant gritty reminder of the desolation that had become her world. Her cabin, a lean-to of weathered planks clinging to the side of a stony outcrop, offered little more than a psychological barrier against the vast, indifferent expanse of the plains. For 2 years, this had been her penance, her hiding place, the grave of a life stolen by fire and bloodshed. She moved through her solitary days like a ghost, her heart a cold stone in her chest, the memories a relentless wind scouring the edges of her sanity. Today, the wind was a banshee, shrieking through the meager cottonwoods by the dry creek bed, whipping the sand into stinging furies. It was a day for hiding, for burrowing deep. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. A flicker of movement at the edge of her vision, something dark against the pale ochre of the earth. Not a coyote, too large. Not a deer, too low. Her breath hitched. Every instinct, honed by loss and sharpened by fear, screamed at her to bolt the flimsy door, to become one with the shadows inside. But she was frozen, a statue of apprehension, as the shape resolved itself. A boy, no older than her Thomas would have been, crawling. Dragging a useless leg, leaving a dark, glistening trail in the dust. Comanche! The word was a brand on her mind, seared there by tales told in hushed, fearful whispers around campfires long ago, by the faces that haunted her nightmares. Her hand flew to the worn wooden handle of the axe propped by the door, its metal cool and familiar. He hadn't seen her. His head was down, his small frame shuddering with an effort that tore at something buried deep within her, something she thought long dead. He collapsed, a heap of buckskin and black hair, less than 50 yards from her threshold. The wind gusted, momentarily clearing the air, and she saw the stain spreading on his thigh, dark as poisoned earth. Her mind reeled. He was the enemy, the savage, the reason her world had shattered. Yet, he was a child. A child bleeding out in the merciless sun. The axe felt heavy, useless. Her throat was a knot of parched fear. What if his warriors were near? What if this was a trap? The questions clawed at her, but beneath them, a fainter whisper, the echo of a lullaby she hadn't sung in years, the phantom touch of a small hand in hers. He moaned, a sound so faint it was nearly lost to the wind, a sound that bypassed all her defenses and struck at the raw, festering wound of her motherhood. She didn't know why she moved. Perhaps it was the sun, beating down with a fury that mirrored the inferno of her past. Perhaps it was the sight of his small, dirt-streaked hand, fingers curled into the dust as if trying to hold onto life itself. She found herself at the water barrel, the dipper clattering against its wooden side as her trembling hand plunged it in. Cool, precious water. Life. She walked towards him, each step a battle against a lifetime of ingrained terror and fresh grief. The dust swirled around her, trying to pull her back, the wind screaming warnings in her ears. He didn't move as she knelt beside him. His eyes were closed, his face contorted in a mask of pain, younger than she first thought. So young. She lifted his head gently. His skin was hot, dry. His lips were cracked and bleeding. Water, she whispered, the word rusty from disuse. She brought the dipper to his mouth. For a moment, nothing. Then, a flicker of his eyelids. He smelled of sweat, blood, and the wildness of the plains, but beneath it all, he was just a boy. A shuddering intake of breath, and then he drank. Greedily, desperately, water spilling down his chin, carving clean rivulets through the grime on his neck. He coughed, a racking sound, and his eyes opened, unfocused, glazed with fever. They were dark, deep-set, and for a fleeting second, held a spark of awareness before clouding over again. He sagged against her arm, his slight weight a shock. She had forgotten the feel of holding another human being. She eased him back down, her mind a blank slate. What had she done? The wind howled again, a mournful, accusatory cry, and the sun beat down. He was burning with fever, his breath coming in ragged rasps. Leaving him here was a death sentence. Taking him in. The thought was madness. Yet, her body moved, her arms sliding beneath his limp form. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight. She gritted her teeth, the old ache in her back flaring, and began to drag him, inch by painstaking inch, towards the dubious sanctuary of her cabin, the dark trail of his blood a stark accusation against the unforgiving earth. The wind seemed to try and tear him from her grasp, the dust stinging her eyes, blurring her vision, but she held on, a grim, desperate resolve hardening within her. The hours that followed were a blur of primal urgency, a descent into a hazy world of whispered comforts and frantic ministrations. The boy, she couldn't bring herself to think of him by any other name, lay on her narrow cot, a pallet of straw and thin blankets, his breathing shallow, his skin radiating a terrifying heat. Ilara moved by instinct, the buried knowledge of a mother surfacing through layers of trauma. She bathed his face with cool water from the barrel, the drops clinging to his dark lashes like tiny diamonds. She tore strips from her one spare shift, her hand surprisingly steady as she cleaned the angry, festering wound on his thigh. It was deep, jagged, the flesh around it swollen and discolored. A gunshot, she realized with a cold dread. Not an arrow. Someone from her own world had done this. The thought settled like a stone in her gut, a grim counterpoint to the fear of his people. She found a small pouch tied to his breechcloth, filled with pungent herbs. She didn't recognize them, but his need was desperate. She crushed a few between her fingers, the scent sharp and earthy, and mixed them with a little bear grease, applying the poultice to the wound. He flinched, a low sound escaping his lips, but didn't wake. Night fell, and the tiny cabin was plunged into a suffocating darkness, broken only by the feeble glow of a single tallow candle. The wind outside had died down, replaced by an unnerving silence, a listening stillness that prickled her skin. Every creak of the cabin walls, every rustle in the thatch roof, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She sat on the hard-packed earth floor beside the cot, watching him, her senses stretched taut. His fevered murmurs filled the small space, unintelligible words in a language she didn't understand, yet their cadence spoke of pain, of fear, of pursuit. Sometimes, he cried out, a sharp, broken sound that echoed the cries from her own nightmares. In those moments, she would reach out, her calloused hand gently touching his forehead, whispering soothing nonsense, words her own mother had used, words she had once whispered to Thomas. The lines of his face, tight with pain, would sometimes soften just a fraction under her touch. Her own past rose to meet his delirium. Faces swam in the candlelight, her husband, Jacob, his smile wide and warm before the smoke and the screams, her son, Thomas, his small hand clutching hers, his eyes wide with a terror no child should ever know. She saw the glint of steel, the orange-hungry flames, smelled the acrid scent of burning homes. She pushed the memories down, a familiar, agonizing discipline. Now was not the time. Now, there was only this boy, this fragile life tethered to hers by a thread of shared water and unspoken desperation. She dozed fitfully, her head against the rough wood of the cot, waking with a start at every sound. The silence of the plains was a different beast at night, filled with the unseen, the imagined. She thought of his warriors, their painted faces, their reputation for swift, brutal vengeance. Would they track him here? Would they see her act of mercy, or would they see only an enemy, a white woman with their wounded child? There was no way to know. She could only wait. Towards dawn, the fever seemed to break slightly. His breathing deepened, became more regular. The tension in his small body eased. He was still terribly weak, but the immediate crisis felt, for a moment, as if it had passed. She watched the pale light seep through the cracks in the cabin walls, painting stripes across the dusty floor. The boy's eyes fluttered open. This time, they were clearer, focused. They rested on her face, dark and unblinking, holding a raw awareness. There was no gratitude in them, not yet. Only a deep, primal caution, the look of a trapped animal assessing a potential threat. She held his gaze, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. She didn't speak, didn't move. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions, with centuries of mistrust. Then, his gaze flickered down to the makeshift bandage on his leg, then back to her. A muscle twitched in his jaw. His lips moved, forming a single, raspy word, a sound that was more breath than voice. "Water," he whispered, this time in English, faint but clear. The shared word, a fragile bridge across a chasm of fear. Relief, potent and unexpected, washed over Ilara, so profound it left her weak. She nodded, reaching for the dipper. The simple act felt monumental, a pact sealed in the dim morning light. Outside, the world was waking, oblivious to the small drama unfolding within the cabin's walls. But Ilara knew. Something had shifted, irrevocably. The sun climbed, a relentless eye in the vast, cloudless sky, baking the parched earth. Inside the cabin, a fragile truce held. The boy, whose name she learned was Little Hawk when he finally spoke it in a voice barely above a whisper, drifted in and out of a shallow, healing sleep. When awake, his dark eyes followed Ilara's every move, watchful, wary, but the animal terror had receded, replaced by a kind of stoic endurance. She moved quietly, tending to his needs, offering him sips of water, then a thin broth she made from a scrawny rabbit she'd snared the day before. He ate little, but enough to sustain the flicker of life that was slowly, painstakingly, rekindling within him. She found the arrowhead near where he had fallen, lodged in the hard-baked clay. It was flint, skillfully knapped, its edges still lethally sharp. She turned it over in her palm, the stone cool against her skin. It was a beautiful, deadly thing, a symbol of his people, of the life he was meant to live. She placed it on the small, rickety table beside her cot, a silent acknowledgement of who he was, of the world he belonged to. Her own world felt distant, almost unreal. The fear of his warriors remained, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid now with a different anxiety, the fear for him. He was so young, so vulnerable. What future awaited him, even if he survived this? The land outside the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of the prairie, the chirp of insects, the distant call of a hawk, were muted, as if the earth itself sensed the impending shift. Ilara found herself scanning the horizon frequently, her eyes straining for any sign of movement, any plume of dust that might signal an arrival. She imagined them, the silent, painted faces, the hard eyes. Would they understand? Or would they see only her white skin, her alien presence? Little Hawk spoke little, his English halting, learned, perhaps, from traders or captives. He asked for nothing, accepted what she offered with a quiet dignity that belied his years. Once, when she readjusted the bandage on his leg, his hand brushed hers, a fleeting, accidental contact. His skin was warm, his touch surprisingly soft. A jolt, not of fear, but of connection, passed between them. It was a dangerous feeling, this fragile empathy. It made her vulnerable in ways she hadn't been since before the fire. The day wore on, each hour stretching into an eternity. The heat in the cabin became oppressive. Little Hawk's breathing was still labored, but the fiery flush of fever had subsided. He watched her mend a tear in her worn skirt, his gaze thoughtful. He pointed to a small, intricate pattern of bead sewn onto the tattered edge of his breechcloth. "Sky," he said, his finger tracing the blue and white design. Mother, a pang, sharp and familiar, pierced Ilara's chest. She nodded, unable to speak, her own mother's face, her own son's, swimming before her eyes. The shared sorrow, the universal language of loss, hung in the air between them. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, mournful shadows across the plains, Little Hawk suddenly stiffened. His head turned towards the door, his nostrils flaring slightly. He listened, his body tensing like a bowstring. Ilara felt it too, a subtle shift in the air, a vibration in the earth beneath her feet, almost imperceptible, like the distant tremor of an earthquake. Then, she heard it. A sound she had unconsciously been dreading, yet expecting. A low, rhythmic rumble, like faraway thunder, but there were no clouds in the sky. It grew steadily, a deep, resonant drumming that seemed to shake the very foundations of her small cabin. Hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats. Little Hawk pushed himself up on his elbows, his eyes wide, no longer with fear, but with a different, more urgent emotion. He looked at Ilara, a desperate plea in his gaze. He tried to speak, but only a choked sound emerged. She understood. They were coming. His people. She moved to the doorway, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, mirroring the thunder outside. She helped Little Hawk sit up, propping him against the doorframe so he could be seen, a desperate, silent appeal to whatever awaited them. Then, with a deep breath that did little to calm the storm within her, she stepped outside, alone, to face the riders. The dust rose first, a colossal, swirling cloud on the western horizon, stained crimson by the setting sun. Then they emerged from it, phantoms taking shape, a dark, flowing river of men and horses, pouring across the plains. Not 20, not 50. Hundreds. A sea of them, their forms silhouetted against the blood-red sky, lances tipped with feathers catching the dying light. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, a force of nature unleashed. The ground trembled beneath Ilara's worn boots. The air thrummed with their power, with their silent, inexorable approach. They fanned out, forming a vast, silent semicircle around her tiny, vulnerable cabin. Ilara stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides, her faded calico dress whipping around her legs in the wind stirred by their passage. She was a solitary, insignificant figure against the backdrop of their overwhelming might. At their head, a warrior sat straighter than the others, his presence commanding even from a distance. He wore a headdress of eagle feathers that flowed down his back, his face shadowed, unreadable. As they drew closer, the details sharpened, the intricate beadwork on their buckskins, the lethal grace of the bows in their hands, the hard, unyielding set of their faces. They were the stuff of nightmares, the embodiment of her deepest fears. And yet, she did not run. She stood, a silent sentinel before her door, before the wounded boy within. The lead warrior reined in his war pony a mere 10 paces from her, the animal snorting, its eyes wild. He was older, his face a mask of deeply etched lines, like a weathered rock formation, his eyes chips of obsidian, cold and piercing. Silence descended, vast and absolute, broken only by the snorting of the horses and the ragged sound of Ilara's own breathing. The weight of 200 pairs of eyes pressed down on her, judging, questioning. This was the moment. The reckoning. The war chief dismounted with a fluid, powerful grace, his moccasined feet landing softly on the dusty earth. He was taller than she had imagined, broader, an imposing figure of sinew and weathered leather. The eagle feathers in his headdress rustled faintly as he moved, the only sound in the suffocating stillness. He did not look at her immediately. His gaze swept over the pitiful cabin, taking in its patched walls, its sagging roof, the thin curl of smoke from the dying embers of her cook fire. His expression remained impassive, a stony mask that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel the sweat trickling down her back, the dryness in her mouth so profound she doubted she could speak even if she dared. She held his gaze when it finally settled on her, a spark of defiance flickering in the depths of her fear. She had done what she had to do. There was no undoing it now. He took a slow step towards her, then another. His eyes, like polished obsidian, missed nothing, the exhaustion etched on her face, the dust clinging to her worn dress, the faint tremor in her hands which she desperately tried to still. Then, a sound from the doorway, weak but clear. Father Little Hawk's voice, raw with emotion. The war chief's head snapped towards the cabin. His stone-like composure fractured for the briefest of moments, a flicker of raw, paternal anguish crossing his features before the mask slammed back into place. He saw his son, propped against the doorframe, pale and weak, but alive. His eyes locked with Little Hawk's, and a silent communion passed between them, a language deeper than words. He moved past Ilara as if she weren't there, kneeling beside his son, his large, calloused hand gently touching Little Hawk's forehead, then his shoulder. He spoke in low, guttural Comanche, his voice surprisingly gentle. Little Hawk responded, his words interspersed with coughs, his small hand gesturing towards Ilara, then towards the plains from whence he had come. He spoke for several minutes, his voice gaining a little strength as he recounted his ordeal. Ilara couldn't understand the words, but she could read the narrative in his gestures, in the inflections of his voice, the pursuit, the shot, the long, desperate crawl, the water she had given him. She saw the name Silas formed on his lips, accompanied by a gesture of disgust and fear. The rancher, Silas Blackwood, known for his cruelty and his festering hatred of the Comanche. The war chief listened intently, his expression unchanging, but Ilara saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, his knuckles whiten where he gripped his son's arm. When Little Hawk finished, a profound silence fell once more. The war chief rose slowly, turning to face Ilara. He looked at her for a long time, his gaze searching, probing. It was not the look of an enemy sizing up a threat, but something else, something deeper, more complex. He saw the grime on her hands from tending the wound, the dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. He saw the worn dipper still resting near the water barrel. "You are the white woman," he said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. His English was heavily accented but clear. "The one who lives alone." Ilara nodded, her throat tight. "My son, he says you gave him water. You cleaned his wound. You sheltered him." Each word was measured, heavy with unspoken implications. "He was hurt," Ilara said, her voice barely a whisper. "He needed help." The chief's eyes narrowed slightly. "Our enemies, the men who shot him, left him for dead. They would not have given him water." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her again. "Why?" The question hung in the air, simple, yet profound. Why had she, a lone white woman, risked everything for a Comanche boy, a traditional enemy? Ilara thought of Thomas, of the emptiness in her arms, the hollow echo in her heart. She thought of the shared humanity she had seen in Little Hawk's eyes, beneath the fear and the pain. "He was just a boy," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "And he was thirsty." The war chief considered her words. He reached into a pouch at his belt and drew out the flint arrowhead she had found. He held it up. This was his. He lost it when he fell. "You found it?" Ilara nodded again, her gaze fixed on the sharp, deadly point. "He told me of Silas Blackwood," the chief continued, his voice hardening, a dangerous edge creeping into it. "Blackwood, who breaks treaties, who kills for sport. My son was tracking a deer that crossed onto land Blackwood claims, but land that has always fed our people." His eyes burned into hers. "You knew the danger. You knew his warriors would come. Yet you did not leave him to die, nor did you betray him to his enemies." It was not a question, but a statement of fact, heavy with a dawning, reluctant respect. The war chief, 2 moons, stood before her, a figure of immense power and quiet authority. The setting sun cast his shadow long and dark across the parched earth, engulfing Ilara in its umbra. Behind him, the silent ranks of his warriors waited, their faces unreadable, their patience absolute. He lowered the arrowhead, tucking it back into its pouch. "My son lives because of you," he stated, his voice devoid of its earlier harshness, now holding a note of something akin to wonder. "You showed him mercy when his own kind would have shown him none." He gestured, a subtle movement of his hand. 2 warriors dismounted and came forward, leading a pack horse laden with bundles. They laid them at Ilara's feet, thick buffalo robes, parfleshes filled with dried meat and berries, a bundle of medicinal herbs far more potent than those Little Hawk had carried. Gifts. Not just payment for services rendered, but an acknowledgement, a sign of profound respect. Ilara stared at the offerings, overwhelmed. This was more than she had seen in years, a wealth beyond imagining in her stripped-down existence. I don't need." She stammered, but 2 moons raised a hand, silencing her. "It is a small thing," he said. For the life of a chief's son he looked towards Little Hawk, who was now being gently lifted by 2 warriors onto a waiting pony. The boy's eye sought Ilara's. He offered her a small, solemn nod, a look of understanding that transcended language, a promise of remembrance. His gaze held a wisdom far beyond his years, a reflection of the ancient soul of his people. 2 moons turned back to Ilara. "Silas Blackwood will learn that the people do not forget," he said, his voice soft but carrying the chilling weight of inevitable retribution. "He will learn that the land still remembers its true guardians." It was not a threat directed at her, but a statement of cosmic justice, a promise that the balance, so violently disrupted, would be restored. There was an implicit protection in his words, a shield extending, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps intentionally, to the lone woman who had stood against the tide of hatred. You live on the edge of our lands, 2 moons continued, his gaze sweeping the desolate horizon. It is a hard place for a woman alone, he paused. You showed honor. The people will not forget this day. You will not be troubled by us. It was more than peace, it was a form of acceptance, a recognition of her courage, her humanity. He mounted his war pony in a single, fluid motion. The setting sun caught the eagle feathers in his headdress, turning them to molten gold. He looked down at Elara one last time. Live well, water giver, he said, the name a benediction. Then, with a subtle command, he turned his horse, and the entire war party moved as one, flowing away like a retreating tide, the thunder of their hooves fading into the deepening twilight, the dust settling slowly behind them. Elara stood alone in the sudden, profound quiet, the gifts at her feet a tangible testament to the extraordinary encounter. The air, which moments before had crackled with tension and unspoken threat, now felt strangely calm, cleansed. The wind, when it returned, was no longer a shriek of desolation, but a soft whisper, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of cooler nights. She bent and touched one of the buffalo robes. It was soft, warm, smelling faintly of wood smoke and the wild. She looked at her hands, the hands that had drawn water, cleaned a wound, offered comfort. They felt different, no longer just the hands of a mourner, a fugitive from sorrow, but the hands of someone who had chosen connection over fear, compassion over bitterness. A fragile shoot of hope, long dormant, began to unfurl within her. The cabin, once a symbol of her isolation, now seemed a sanctuary forged in courage. The land, once an enemy, felt less hostile, its vastness no longer a threat but a space that might, perhaps, hold a different future. She was still alone, but not entirely. A bond had been forged, an understanding reached across a divide once thought unbridgeable. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long had loosened its grip, replaced by a quiet strength, a renewed sense of purpose. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but tonight, Elara felt a flicker of peace, a sense that even in the deepest wilderness, a single act of kindness could change the course of not just one life, but perhaps, in some small way, the heart of the world itself. The stars began to prick the darkening sky, cold and distant, yet suddenly, they seemed to shine with a warmer, more benevolent light. What if one act of courage could bridge the deepest divides? What if the water we offer to a stranger could ripple outwards, changing not just their life, but our own, and perhaps even the world around us? Think about a time you chose compassion when fear might have been easier. Let us know in the comments below what you believe is the truest measure of strength. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the human heart, and click the next video to see where courage takes us next.